the closed captioning, Patty, you are good. Okay, she's good. See, we should be live. So Malik, do you see us on Twitter?
I do.
Okay, great. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to start the webinar now. Okay. All right, everyone should be able to see us. Hello. Okay. All right. And we can probably wait a minute or two and allow people to kind of trickle in. I know that there are some folks that were probably waiting in the waiting room. So we'll probably start around 6:02, 6:03 and get started. Right? Does that sound good to everyone? Cool. But yeah, other than that, how is it going? How's the week been so far? I think someone else asked that, but I don't think everyone was here.
Intense.
Today
You're
has
talking
been.
regular weeks or Black and Micro week?
I mean, it could be either. Just in general, how are you doing, Chelsea?
I feel like Black and Micro week, good. Regular week is also intense. Yeah, very busy.
Doing things in between your schedules.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Malik. And I'll also record a version of this too.
I was coming off a short course for faith leaders in the community. That was yesterday and today, 2.5 hours, both days, when I joined you this morning. And
wow.
It was shifting hats for a moment, but the same subject.
Okay. Great. It's about 6:02, so let's get started. So thank you so much to everyone that is participating in this panel. Thank you to the audience for participating in our Black and Virology panel. Today, we have some very great people to talk to about what it is to be a Black virologist, especially in today's time. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Linnell Williams. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and I study virus physics. And the purpose of this panel is essentially to talk about the journey and experiences that Black virologists have, in addition to providing information and answers to the general public about science, about health, and anything else you guys would like to talk about. So if you're an audience member and you have questions, please feel free to hold them off until the end, because we will have 15 minutes or so at the end to answer the questions that are in the Q&A. And also, if you are on Twitter and you're watching live, you can also comment your questions underneath the live streaming of this current panel. But before we begin, and I have the panelists introduce themselves, I'd like to first say that Black and Microbiology would like to thank all of our sponsors for helping to make this event possible. We would like to give a very special thanks to our gold level sponsors, and those include the American Society of Microbiology, the American Society for Virology, and Kiogen. Their generous support is instrumental to the success of Black and Microbiology Week and, events beyond this. And we appreciate their continued efforts in supporting and recognizing Black microbiologists in particular. And so we're going to get started. We have 4 wonderful panelists here today, and I would like to allow all of them to introduce themselves: Dr. Taylor, Dr. Spriggs, Dr. Corbett, and Dr. Fuller. If each of you, and I'll call your name, and just go in the order that I see in my screen currently, if you could tell us, your name, what your current institution is, briefly what you currently research, and it would be nice to hear about what led you to virology in the first place. And we'll take a few moments for each of you to, briefly answer those questions. So we can start with Dr. Kishana Taylor.
Oh, hi, I'm Kishana Taylor. I am currently a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon University, researching the role of the innate immunity in SARS coronavirus infection and the development of severe COVID-19. And I guess what got me into virology, it was actually kind of a fluke. So I was really interested in being a marine mammal veterinarian, dolphin trainer type person. And when you apply to veterinary school, they encourage you to diversify your resume or your CV so that you look more competitive, because vet school is very competitive. And so I ended up getting into some avian influenza, avian virology research, and actually really fell in love with it. And then decided that epidemiology and microbiology and virology was really it for me. And that's kind of how I got put on the path towards my PhD in virology. So.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Kizzy Corbett.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kizmikia Corbett. I am a research fellow at the Vaccine Research Center at the National Institutes of Health, and the scientific lead for the coronavirus immunopathogenesis team there. And how did I get into virology? I don't know. I guess the universe just told me this is where I'm supposed to be. I overall have always been very interested in microbiology. And I kind of took a tour around the field, starting in bacteriology, and understanding that I didn't really like that much. But and then also in some healthcare sociology work that I did in undergrad helped me to kind of merge my interest in public health with vaccine development. And by way of vaccine development and some of the internships I did, I stumbled upon viruses and how cool they are, and how if you develop vaccines for them, you might be able to save the world against the next pandemic. And so that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Spriggs.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I guess first, I'm a postdoc at the University of Michigan. I'm actually in the Department of Cell and Developmental Biology there, but I'm in a virus lab studying how polyomavirus gets to the nucleus during viral entry. So like Kizzy and Kishana, I guess I also kind of stumbled into viruses. I was a microbiology major in undergrad, and I kind of chose it because I wanted to be a biology major, and they didn't have biology. And I'm like, okay, well, microbiology has biology in the name, so that one seems good. So I picked that one, and one of the requirements for the degree was to do undergraduate research. So I emailed a bunch of people in the department, and I got settled with a woman named Dr. Michelle Fluke, who studied polyomaviruses and how they are, she studied them as a tool for understanding breast cancer progression. And so I just thought that was really fascinating. And I guess since then, I've just been into viruses and virus research.
Thank you, Chelsea. Dr. Fuller.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those who are putting together Blacks in Microbiology. So I am a virology professor at the University of Michigan Medical School in microbiology and immunology. And I study now, I do field implementation on prevention of HIV, translating what we as scientists and physicians know to the community, particularly faith leader networks, which is what I was doing this morning with COVID. My original training was at the University of North Carolina and then the University of Chicago as a postdoc, where I started working with herpes simplex virus. And so the first 20 years of my career as a professor, I worked on herpes simplex entry. And since herpes simplex is a lot like HIV in terms of its entry process, we always kept up with the HIV literature, to the point that I finally realized that HIV is causing such havoc around the world that this is something we can do something about in terms of prevention. People just don't know. So that's how I was segued into the field work that I do now. And I've always been interested in viruses since I was in grad school. I think they're pretty cool. They're just so amazing in terms of ability to reproduce and do what they do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. And before I go into the questions, I want to reiterate to the audience, if you do have questions for the audience members, please make sure you add them to the Q&A, even if it's during the panel. We'll make sure that we get to all of them at the end. So my first question for you guys, especially this pandemic has brought so much attention to viruses in general, what they are, et cetera. For our audience members, especially for those who don't know, it would be great if you guys can talk about a little bit, well, what is a virus, and why are viruses so interesting, and why are you guys so interested in studying them? And to kind of add to that, like, should we actually be afraid of them? Are they things to actually fear? If anyone would like to go first.
Sure, I teach about this, so let's take a stab at it. So viruses are microbes that are intracellular parasites. They're made of genetic and protein, and they must replicate in a cell, unlike bacteria or fungi, which are independent organisms, one-cell organisms or multi-cell organisms that can reproduce on their own. There's debate always about whether viruses are life or not, but in my opinion, the fact that they can reproduce themselves so robustly once they're in the right environment, and that environment is inside of a living cell, then as far as I'm concerned, that's pretty alive. And so whether they're good or bad, we typically think of viruses as pathogens. That's what we hear mostly about. But it turns out there are lots of bacteriophages, which are viruses that live inside of bacteria that are very, very important for our microbiome and our life cycle. So we tend to hear about the disease-causing viruses, but there are lots of others, and their viruses are in all species. So I'll just stop there in case somebody else wants to weigh in.
I just want to say hashtag team viruses are alive. So thank you.
Went there, like
Viruses are alive.
Earlier on Twitter, so I'm feeling very validated right now.
Very good.
Yeah, so everything that Dr. Fleur said, and then I just wanted to add that I fell in love with viruses because they are sort of like this enigma, right? So people make the argument that they're not alive, but they do replicate, and they do pass on their genetic material, and they survive, right? And not only do they survive, but they cause sometimes all of this chaos, like kind of in what we're sitting in now. And I just found it really fascinating that something so tiny, something that doesn't even have all of the requirements for what some scientists would consider life, but they're still able to do all of these really great and these really amazing things. And so that's kind of how I got sucked into Team Virus. Yeah, so.
Awesome. Anyone else want to weigh in?
I just want to say, along the lines of, are they always bad? I think that one of the most interesting things to me about viruses is the idea that, we think of bacteria as there's good bacteria and bad bacteria, but we always think of viruses as just being bad. And one line of research that I think is super cool is the idea of oncolytic viruses. And so these are viruses that in theory will only infect cancer cells, and they'll, wreak their havoc on those cancer cells, but they won't infect our normal cells. So the idea that a virus could possibly be used to treat cancer seems like, it could be good and bad depending.
No, that's amazing. Anyone else?
One other quick thing, as was just mentioned, viruses have been really important in figuring out some of the molecular details of how cells work, even cloning. The reverse transcriptase of retroviruses is a major tool in being able to do the incredible genomics and molecular biology that we do now. So they have, because they're able to help us look at mechanisms in a different way as vectors, as well as what they do, they've contributed immensely to what we understand in science and what we can do now.
Yeah, the vector piece actually is pretty important. When she spoke about oncolytic viruses, viruses that have the potential to be neuroinvasive have actually been thought about as used for therapies for neurodegenerative diseases. So this is viruses are always thought to be bad, but I think that like most things in the universe, there is a spectrum. And one good thing about science is that you get to explore the spectrum. The gray area is kind of our playground, no matter what the field is, I think. So, I tend to think of viruses only in the context of immune responses. And so I call myself a viral immunologist and not really a stereotypical virologist. But also kind of in that context, you see that sometimes the way that viruses play on the immune system is actually could be good for the immune system. So, good and bad.
So this is obviously Team Virus.
Obviously.
Great. Again, back to like this sort of heightened attention that viruses are getting, especially as a result of this pandemic. There's this heightened sense of fear, not just of viruses, but also of vaccines. It would be great if one of you, especially Dr. Corbett, considering the work that you've done, could kind of talk about, what is a vaccine specifically, and where do they sort of land in the sort of scope of virology research, and why are they so important?
So a vaccine, broadly speaking, without doing a seminar, is something that triggers the immune system to recognize or remember a particular pathogen. In the case, for example, for SARS-CoV-2, since it's most relevant for the time, these vaccines generally recognize one part of a virus and use that part of the virus to show the immune system that part of the virus so that the immune system remembers it. You know, the reason why I got into vaccine development, generally speaking, is because vaccines really lay in the middle ground of basic virology in this case, and public health. I like to think of them, and a lot of people like to think of vaccines as one of the greatest public health contributions and inventions ever, as far as their contributions to lives saved. I think that that's probably going to be the outcome in case there is a vaccine that proves efficacious, or vaccines that prove efficacious in this pandemic. As far as, you know, it's very odd to say and to show, I think, outside of the context of a pandemic, how different parts of different fields play onto each other. Mm-hmm. So this is obviously we're in an era where we're really allowing ourselves to really recognize how basic research is informing translational research, and then it's potentially informing something that actually goes into a human being and saves lives. But generally speaking, we think about things kind of in piece by piece. So the virologist doesn't always think about the vaccine, and vice versa. But it is all kind of coming together, and it is cyclic. It's a constant kind of revolving wheel of how knowledge kind of informs each other. And no part of the field can work without the other. Mm-hmm. The one thing that's important around vaccine hesitancy is that I think one of the things that we don't translate well as virologists is how much of just basic knowledge has informed the vaccine development process. And so and also basic immunology as well. And so for me, I think that's one of the key things that kind of translate. And I think that this era really shines a light on the need and also the ability of us as virologists to translate it, particularly in our community as Black people.
Awesome. Kishana, Chelsea, Dr. Fuller, do you guys have anything to add, especially as folks who are currently in the academy?
Just that vaccines are such a critical part of our medical approach to infectious diseases. And as was just said, this spectrum of science ranges from the most molecular to like the physics, biology that you may do, Linnell, to the very applied things and implementation through translation of vaccines, to actually getting that information to people, which is what the public health people do so well. So we tend to look at universities in silos and subjects, but really there's a range, and they're very necessarily dependent on one another.
Awesome. Chelsea, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I'll just say, I feel like there's a lot of mistrust in the Black community around vaccines just based off of history, which I definitely understand. And so I think it makes it even more important that Black scientists are involved in these processes. I think it's really great that Kizzy is all over, the forefront of being involved in this this vaccine development, just to help build trust. And also we need to be able to translate what we know being in academia to the public, just to help people understand how vaccines are actually made, and that things are thought out well enough that it's probably safer to get the vaccine than to just risk it with COVID.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the distrust piece, because we will also get into that a little bit later as well. Sorry, Dr. Fuller, did you have something to say?
Nope. I have lots to say, but I will hold it.
It's fine.
I was just going to add that one of the reasons why I was really excited about Black and Microbiology Week, in addition to getting to know and to talk to other Black microbiologists, was that I thought we were positioned really well to be able to kind of pull on that communication piece with the general public and with the Black community more so than we have been in the past. And I thought that it was really, really important to try to do something like this, like questions and answers, and making it available to the public so that we can sort of try to combat the hesitancy by showing people that there are Black scientists involved in the process, and that we are, pro-vaccine, and that we understand the distrust, but that this is also something that we're trying to develop to help as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do have another question that actually came up earlier in one of our Q&As that Dr. Fuller was a part of, that I also wanted to ask about. That's kind of been all over the media, especially again, as a result of this pandemic, this idea of like viruses like jumping species. If someone can sort of like explain that in a way that our audience members can understand, and also speak a little bit more about where do you think virology research can sort of go in terms of being able to not only prevent pandemics, but also again develop a better understanding of viruses, such that we can take advantage or even use them in some ways, as someone mentioned earlier, this idea of using I saw earlier something about phage therapy, for instance, developing this sort of like understanding of viruses and moving away this sort of idea of fear. So I know that was a lot in one sort of like question, but just thinking about, explaining this like idea that viruses, they're jumping species. Does that mean we're going to have like 16 pandemics over the next, week or next year? Or maybe,
actually, that is the truth. It's actually maybe. Right. So part of my PI and I, we wrote a review called World on Fire around the idea of pandemic preparedness and what that looks like from the vaccine standpoint. But there are 24 species of viruses that have the ability to jump from their reservoirs in animals to human beings. And the reason why, for example, we've seen this happen over the last, say, 20 years or so with 3 different coronaviruses is because it's not as hard as it may seem. We have evolved from animals, and particularly are more closely related to certain mammals than we, generally recognize on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, the receptor or the thing on cells that viruses attack to get inside the cell are fairly closely related. You can change one protein residue and be able to switch from one species to another. And that's documented for coronaviruses, for influenza viruses, et cetera. And so the idea that, species jump, or what we call it technically is zoonotic transmission, but jumping from animals to humans is something that could happen, you said jokingly, 16 times in the next week.
Could actually.
Far stretch, but at the end of the day, the biology could work out that way. And the way that you prepare yourselves is actually, far better than what we have now. But I can only speak from the vaccine development standpoint, is studying each of those different families of viruses at such a mechanistic, detailed level that we understand what to do if there's a sign that one of these viruses has jumped into humans. And, that takes a portfolio of research funds, et cetera. But I think that it's something that we have to start thinking about more and more. I mean, Dr. Fauci has said we've entered the era of pandemics. And the truth is, as we are, evolving and becoming more overpopulated and all of these things, society, my friend is a viral evolutionary biologist. And in the beginning of this, even before the pandemic was called, he said, I think what we're about to see is that even though viruses don't think, that this virus is going to be able to pick up on the holes in our society and societal structure, the pieces of the society that we didn't think about rebuilding or improving. And it's true. it's targeting vulnerable populations. It's, hitting rural areas where hospitals are very far apart and, overcrowded, and all of these things that we've been we're living in as our norm. The virus is starting to pick up on overpopulated cities, et cetera. And so, the things that we can do from a virology standpoint is flood the field. Because the truth is that the reason why our response to coronaviruses has been so rapid, so to speak, is because we studied coronaviruses and there was a background of research around coronaviruses. But had this been a Borneo virus, and it could have been, we'd be out of luck. So, I think that we have a lot of work to do around pandemic preparedness in general, but I'm happy that even though the outcome of this pandemic is terrible, I'm happy that finally there is some visibility around the field and the need for the basic research in the field.
Yeah, so Kizzy set that up pretty well. I would consider myself a viral evolutionary or an evolutionary virologist as well. And viruses, and viruses are my jam. So, but the way that I like to explain it is that I think for a really long time we've considered, right, like animal disease and human disease, these separate, I guess, filters, right? So like they're two separate circles. But in reality, they kind of like cross over each other all the time, right? So you have specific animal reservoirs like raccoons or like other urban wildlife who live in our backyard, or in the case of the coronaviruses, it usually ends up being bats, which in different countries and whatnot, there's a lot of overlap between these populations. So as we see more overlap between these animal reservoirs and human populations, I think we can definitely expect to see more spillover, which is, I guess, like another term for it. Basically, when you see a zoonotic disease, or in this case, a zoonotic virus, spill over from its animal reservoir into humans. And so I absolutely think that this is something that we should be prepared for, or to start preparing for, because as far as, like she said, like with viruses, we don't really know that much, and it's not really a heavily studied area. And I mean, honestly, like in terms of the field of virology, coronaviruses was really a small field before we saw the boom in SARS coronavirus 2 research. And so, yeah, I mean, she's definitely more on the side of immunology and vaccinology, but I think that the basic research, right, understanding what our animal reservoirs are, understanding what kind of viruses are inside these animal reservoirs, and then the potential. So like, it's really more a game of chance. And so how likely are we to come into contact with an animal that's infected with a new virus? And then how likely is it that that virus is going to be able to exploit the different cell populations in the animal reservoir and then in humans? And then also something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently, under the umbrella of One Health, which talks about how human health, animal health, and then the environmental health are all related, is then adding in the piece about the way that society stratifies our populations, right? And so we're seeing now with this spillover event, with this pandemic, that the populations that are being most affected are the populations that we don't think about, or the populations that get neglected, and how that then perpetuates the spread of that virus over time. And it's going to continue to enforce or continue to fuel the pandemic because they're not populations that we necessarily consider. And so I think we should be able to pull in social stratification and health disparities into that One Health umbrella. I think that that's going to be really important as we start to see more pandemic and more viral spillover as well.
It's actually funny because when ZIKA came around, I guess, what was it, like around 4 or 5 years ago? And it was largely affecting women and children, right? And so a lot of the people that make decisions around where funding goes had the innate, I guess, choice to likely say, well, we don't really have to funnel funding in that direction. And then, all of a sudden there's an article that says, oh, ZIKA can, be transmitted via sperm and cause like your testicles to shrink. And then there's an upsurge of funding. And so people oftentimes have this idea that it can't be me. And I'm not just talking about like the big wigs who, you know, have the pocketbooks. I'm talking about even us, right? I mean, think about what you were doing in February when Italy was on fire with this virus, right? Oh, like, no,
I was saying it's on its way, is what I was saying.
I actually was saying
get
that
ready.
too, but a lot of
That's
people
what I was saying.
a lot of people were not. I mean, I have a tweet from the 24th saying like, this is a pandemic. Like right now it's a pandemic. I think that one of the things that should hopefully come out of this is that generally speaking, we have to get out of the idea that it can't happen. And even though it's you know, a little bit pessimistic to say, oh, these viruses are going to start jumping into humans and all these things, but to start thinking that way and to study them with the kind of the unknown or the maybe is really the only way to go.
If I could just quickly add, we teach about emerging pathogens, and viruses are really ideal for that in the sense that it's so easy for them to move into a different species because they really must get into the cell near the genetic material of every host. So you look at Zika, you look at Ebola's immersion out of Central Africa into a wider area carried by bats. You look at avian influenza, you look at coronavirus. So as has been said, this is going to happen because human beings are pushing ourselves into the territory, into the niches of animals where we were once more separate. Now we are not. Swine flu in 2008. So we've had plenty of examples of this. And as we become more industrialized and more populated, and the disparities between populations occur such that there's fuel or places where these viruses can replicate, we will see more of this, and we will have to make provisions to handle these emerging pathogens better.
Yeah, I just want to add that, you know, as Dr. Fuller said, it seems like every 2 or 3 years there's another emerging virus that everyone freaks out about. And now we're at this pandemic level with coronavirus, which is by far the worst one, but you know, it's not going to be the last one. There's always going to be like another emerging virus for whatever reason. And so I think that it's important also to fund virus research that is not necessarily like the big hot virus right now.
Yeah.
So I feel like before all of the funding started switching to coronavirus, everything was still on Zika. Like Zika was 2016. And so, you know, I think Zika research is important, but so are all of the other viruses. And so, I mean, I would hazard to say that maybe there was a coronavirus researcher before, like in 2018, 2019, whose grants were getting rejected because people thought that they weren't important enough. So I think that we should just be mindful that there's always going to be another virus, and funding needs to be equalized between, well, not equalized, but just like spread out amongst potential emerging viruses.
Yeah.
Used wisely is the word I'll say.
Well, I mean, that's the truth, right? The only reason why my work was able to fuel this kind of vaccine development shenanigan that's happening right now is because it's at the National Institutes of Health, where we are allowed to do riskier things and take the chance around funding decisions, because our funding comes via different mechanisms and not via grant. And so I think that, you know, largely, and also that my PI was able to give me that level of independence around the project that I decided to work on. And that's true. It's like, if you're in academia and have the same level of knowledge, you might say, well, I can't work on coronaviruses because who's going to pay for these expensive studies, because they are very expensive. And so, you know, I don't know what will come of this, but I hope that someone really, you know, takes a look at the other 23 families of viruses and decides that, okay, this is how we need to break the money down to study all of them simultaneously.
Yeah, I'm so glad you guys brought this up. Actually, one of the things I wanted to kind of ask about, you kind of touched on already, is like, what are the pros and cons of this sort of like heightened attention every time we have a pandemic or an outbreak of viruses, et cetera. And it's great you guys are speaking on this idea of ensuring that we do not only like fund basic research, but fund all basic research, even the research that we may not necessarily think is extremely important currently, because you don't necessarily know if it's going to be important. One other con I wanted to kind of bring up in terms of the heightened intention is misinformation, and like the ability for like misinformation to sort of be brought out to the public, and how that can be amplified through like various outlets. And, you know, when we're having like issues, to kind of quote one of the questions that kind of popped up earlier, is about, you know, being able to communicate this information to family and like who's reading what and like the media. But what are you guys' thoughts on like misinformation, not just about the pandemic, but also about science in general? I know, for instance, I even have family members myself who have been for years afraid of the flu vaccine, you know? So how do we, what are sort of the you know, cons of this sort of misinformation getting out there, and how can we sort of participate as like Black scientists in particular in sort of assisting in educating, not just educating, but encouraging sort of personal exploration and personal sort of like reaching for the truth about these things, so that people are more informed even before these things happen?
You mentioned the flu vaccine, and I was going to say that earlier, that that's still an area where many people, I hear often that, well, I'm not going to get a flu vaccine because it gives you the flu. Well, it's a dead virus. It's actually not alive, so cannot give you the flu. What is happening is the response of the body to the new antigen, which is what you want. You're priming your body to be able to respond. So to address your question about misinformation, that's so rampant out there, particularly around COVID in the internet. And I've always said that scientists are responsible to do really great basic research, as well as then to be involved in communicating that to the public, both to the grantors as well as the consumers, the people, the families, the churches, the community leaders, and those people who have to then utilize those findings. Otherwise, if we don't do that, then the knowledge is great, but the knowledge is not having its greatest application and impact if people don't know, yes, I don't have an underlying disease, but I still need to get a flu vaccine. Okay. Or I may not be high risk for COVID. I may not be among the group that was thought to get really severe disease, but I may become infected and become an asymptomatic carrier, which will then, one, propagate the virus and increase the amount in the environment and keep it going. But two, it might actually allow me to infect somebody else who will be severely sick because of their either immune response or whatever it is that leads to severe COVID-19 versus an asymptomatic infection. Communication and accurate communication, therefore, is so critical. We only need to look at the people that drank bleach because someone said, well, if it works on the outside, it should, maybe it'll help on the inside. So correct information. I know all of you have seen things that are signed at the bottom on Facebook or Instagram that says this came from Johns Hopkins, or this came from Stanford, or this came from someplace. And you go back and you read it, it's like, okay, now this has a few tidbits of truth, but this cannot be from somebody from Stanford or Johns Hopkins who's responsible, or Michigan, or wherever you are, because they would not write something that has this much material that is not even fathomable. So we as scientists are responsible in part for communicating to the public what scientists and clinicians need to know. And if we leave it up to others, the message often gets twisted or changed in a way that's not effective. And as we know, even from the Tuskegee studies, when something's out there, and that was all true and that was all dreadful. But, in order to do these vaccine trials, we have to get past this, because if we don't have African Americans and other people of color in the vaccine trials, we will have a much more difficult time knowing if the vaccines work for the wide range of people that need it to work for. And the vaccines will have a much more difficult time getting approval. So we have got to get accurate information out, and that information has to come from people who look like the people we want to engage. Some of those people are us. We are responsible.
Yes, and so some of the things that I try to communicate when speaking with my family include, so if you see something and it just sounds, scientists usually are not going to use super sure language because we understand, right, that like there's a process. Sometimes research shows one thing, sometimes it shows another thing. We usually have to do experiments 20 times before we're even slightly convinced that it's accurate. And so if you see something that's saying this is the fact and that's just what it is, then more than likely it's not a scientist who's behind the messaging. I also encourage kind of like what Dr. Fuller said in terms of when it says this information comes from a source, go actually read that source and see if what you're reading corresponds to what they're saying in the meme. Oftentimes, right, they'll pick out a couple of things, but I think specifically scientific literature can be hard to parse for those who don't have the terminology, the language, or the knowledge. And so people can get away with saying additional things that maybe scientists would be able to filter out, but that the layperson or the general public might not be able to pick out. Another thing that I have tried to communicate with my family is that we don't usually communicate through memes in general. We do usually communicate through like press releases or scientific papers and those sorts of things. And so it's just, again, really important to go back to a primary source. And then if all else fails, my mom will usually come to me and say, you know, I heard this, or this thing says this, what do you think? And so then I can be that conduit to kind of break it down for her so that she understands what's happening and what's going on. And I think that relationship, it has been really important. So not everybody is going to know a scientist that they trust, but hopefully by me relaying that information to her, she can then relay it to her friends who maybe don't have a direct line. And so trying to communicate through word of mouth and through relationships has been really important, I think, in this pandemic so far.
I agree. I think, you know, it's really hard for people to try to even get access to a lot of these scientific articles. You have to pay for them. I have to pay to read my own paper if I'm not logged on to like the university's Wi-Fi, which is ridiculous. But, you know, so if my mom finds a paper, she might try to like read it, but, you know, it's really hard if she can even get her hands on it to decipher it. And so Kashana was mentioning, you know, just that at like her mom's last resort is as I have a scientist as a daughter, I can ask her these things, but a lot of people in our community don't know scientists. So like, who's going to be their source? And so there is a lot of miscommunication. I feel like at the beginning of the pandemic is especially frustrating for me when I was seeing everyone just say like, oh, don't worry. It's just the flu. It's just like the flu. And I'm like, I study virology. Influenza is not the same as a coronavirus. They're like so distinct just in their makeup and the way that they act. And so
also, even if it is like the flu, like just so we are like aware as a community, the flu is actually a dangerous,
pretty bad.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous virus, and a new strain of the flu, had this been a pandemic strain of the flu,
That's right,
it would still be in
really bad
desperate trouble the same way we are. So, you know, I'm first of all, I'm actually, for me, the one thing that's coming out of what is considered the glory of this entire vaccine development process is that I have just become aware that my community and the people that I care about the most are probably some of the most misguided around the scientific process and, you know, trust in science and what sources to even consider trustworthy. Because if you ask people a lot of times, like, where did you get their information? It'll be like some website that is just curated by some blogger somewhere. And it's like, what? In my mind, as much as I can empathize with just wanting to get some type of information, in my mind, it's like, why would you even trust science from a website? And for me, because everyone does not have a daughter who they can call, or, I mean, I'm getting hundreds of DMs that I try to go through, but sometimes it takes me like a month to get back to people. So when you don't have immediate access to a scientist that you trust, I mean, I think that we just have to relate to people, well, these are the sources that put information out in a very digestible and correct way.
Can I insert here?
Now,
You brought up a really good point that I wanted to kind of course, add to the conversation since it's been touched on, is like also if in addition to the question, if folks wanted to like expand on, you know, where some of that distrust actually comes from, right? And like continue to talk about ways in which we can sort of mend that as well. I think someone spoke earlier about, you know, seeing our faces essentially at the forefront of these kinds of like trials, et cetera, is one way of mending that. But I wanted to add that in there, and Dr. Fuller, if you would like to also
sure.
expound on that.
Yes, I would. I'm trying not to lift up my own work, but I think it actually fits here. So in realizing that as a basic scientist, I was doing stuff that I really enjoyed doing and really getting to understand a tiny bit of how nature worked in the basic laboratory. It's so fascinating. But again, when people are not knowing things and you see that they are unnecessarily getting infected and unnecessarily very ill or dying or living a certain way in their life when that could be prevented. So what we've done, and it's a model that can be used in multiple places, is making trusted messengers. My network happens to be religious leaders. You know how people of color, for the most part, still listen to their religious leaders, their pastors, that missionary, whoever it is that they happen to be part of. And so getting the essential science, clear understanding to those people, not by knocking on every door, but by going to the networks, the highest leaders in the networks, and having them engage, and then having them give access to their leaders such that the leaders become science competent and science informed. They don't have to know every detail, but they have to understand enough that they know the right questions to ask. They know who to go to for resources, because not everybody's going to understand everything, but you know when you need to ask somebody else, like your mom needs to go to her daughter scientist. Well, everybody, as was said, doesn't have a daughter our son is a scientist, but you know who to go to. There's the county health department, or there's a website that is a legitimate website with information. So getting the information to the opinion leaders, the trusted people in the community who are not the professional scientists or clinicians, such that everyday community people have access to information. If we make it available and we make it understandable, people are fascinated by science and medicine. Yeah. And we always also advocate that people never go to a physician's office without an advocate. Take a family member or somebody with you, because as a patient, you're hearing things one way, but if you have somebody else with you, you can translate that. So just giving these simple tips to people who engage with folks all the time, even around the vaccine trials for COVID, we are going to have to be in those trials in order for them to be legitimate. But we still have that mistrust, which is deservedly so, of the research system. So we, folks that look like us, are going to have to be highly involved in helping our people figure out, is this vaccine safe for me to be in? And what do I need in order to assure that if something happens, the system has me covered with healthcare that I need? That's so important for all of us to do. So our way of doing it is to create trusted messengers that can give science messages to people who trust that these people are legitimate and identify with who you're talking to.
Yeah, that's a very common technique. NIH is doing the same thing, is you know, filtering the information through trusted community leaders. It's a very common technique, and it actually does work. But the one thing that we have to, on the other side, remember is that when trust is destroyed at the level of which it has been destroyed repeatedly, and still, even, you know, last week, Breonna Taylor,
with COVID,
outside of COVID,
and other things,
our community is destroyed like on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
So we have to rebuild that really brick by brick, and it's gonna take some time, far more time than hopefully this pandemic lasts. But you know, the one thing that I have in my actions around like community engagement have tried to relay to our community is that when you think about trust and when you think about mistrust, the one thing that you have to understand, although our mistrust comes from a place where it is completely understandable, is that mistrusting someone or a system does not benefit us in any way, because it only gives the system a vehicle to ignore us in general. So if we as a group come together and say, oh, we're not going to trust the vaccine, we're not going to be in the vaccine trials. So if the system says, well, okay, then why would we even allocate some of the first doses to Black people who wouldn't take it anyway? Or why would we care about the data that comes from Black people in regarding safety and efficacy from the trials? And so, you know, as much as there is an onus on us as scientists and, you know, in my case, vaccine developer, et cetera, to get the trust right and to target our community and help them to understand the data that's coming out of the trials, et cetera. On the other hand, I try to help people to understand that you have to lend those, when someone lays a brick, you do have to kind of come in the direction of trust with us, because
Absolutely.
otherwise you make it so easy to be forgotten. And it's kind of, you know, if you have a boyfriend, when he walks out the door, if you say to him,
I don't trust you.
anything that you're doing when you leave this house, it doesn't matter what he does when he leaves the house, because you're not going to trust it anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's if you really put that kind of analogy on it, that's kind of the way that I am trying to make people grasp the concept. But you know,
there are two pieces. One, people have to have some trust or be willing to examine and verify, and then people who have to be trustworthy. So these two things have to come together.
And I'm not talking about,
it's going to take both of them in order to do what we need to do.
and I'm not talking about like lending all of your trust, but I'm talking about letting someone borrow with so that they have accountability. Letting someone borrow your trust for a moment so that they are accountable for the piece of trust that you gave them. That's really,
we say trust but verify is what we're saying. Trust folks enough to get the information that you need to know whether this works for you. I know there are lots of other questions too that we have here. So
yeah, I was gonna say we have about 7 minutes left. So yeah, Kishana, you can finish your thought, and then some of these questions have actually already been answered. So I'm gonna pick maybe one question that hasn't been answered. But thank you guys so much for having this discussion, because quite a few of these have already been answered.
Yeah, I was also going to say there is a third piece in that I don't think that in terms of education, in terms of like science education, right now our system is doing a very good job of giving people the basic tools that they would need to kind of figure out the basics of what we're doing in terms of science anyway. So understanding like risks and ratios, right? So like when you say that you have a greater risk of contracting COVID when you don't wear a mask, like does that really compute to someone who doesn't like, you know, do risk ratios over the amount of time? And then being able to kind of bridge the education gap, I think requires scientists to advocate for better education policies. And I know sometimes it can be kind of murky for scientists to want to get involved in politics, but I think that that's a really important piece, because I think it would be easier to trust if they could at least understand a little bit of what we were saying to kind of like move that trust in the right direction if there's more understanding, as opposed to having to depend completely on someone to translate, right? So like if you are speaking a different language, you can pick up a couple of words, you might be able to string together the general like tone of a conversation. But if you know nothing, you're just kind of sitting there and you don't know. And I think it heightens the distrust because there's no ability to translate. And so I think that that's important too.
I think that we need to meet people where they are. If they don't understand the word ratio, then we need to pick a new word.
That's a
what
good,
I think.
yeah.
I'm like, I think that we're talking over people. And I'm actually I watched the panelists on CNN and all this, and I'm just like, what? No one, my cousins and them don't understand you. So like you have done nothing for the common person in like your 4-minute span on this national network. So we have to meet people where they are.
I think that's a good note to actually have, especially because communication is extremely important, especially in our communities. So in the last 5 minutes, if each of you can take maybe like a little less than a minute to possibly answer this very last question from one of our audience members about, what aspect of your research in particular has been most exciting, and where do you see the future of virology going in the next 10 to 20 years? And if you have a moment to also say one piece of advice you may give to future virologists who are coming behind you. It's a loaded question.
That's a lot of questions.
I know.
I know.
Answer one if you would like. Maybe I should have just chosen one, but I was reading what the audience member, but we can go over it a little bit. Yeah. Chelsea, we'll start with you.
All right, I'm just going to answer part of it since I only have a minute. I'm going to take the question about advice for future virologists. Pick the virus that you think is interesting. All viruses are so diverse, and I think that oncogenic viruses that cause cancer are super cool. Kashana loves Bunya viruses. They're just so different, and there's space for everyone to study these things. If you're a Black virologist, I just want to tell you to persist. If this is your passion, just know that you can do it. And, whichever direction that you want to go for your career, there are others of us out there. There's other people that you can have community with. If they're not in your institutions, you don't see them. But if this is your passion, then persist.
Awesome. Dr. Fuller, do you want to go next?
I can do that. I think having come from doing molecular virology to now community engagement, I think seeing people's lives change by understanding a little bit of something, like people who didn't understand about HIV drugs now understanding what they can do and why they can do what they do. I had a young woman tell me that even though her husband was a HIV tester in Zambia, she and he and their family had never been tested, but she came to one of our trusted messenger workshops. And when I came back a year later, she said, we all got tested. And out of the 5 of us, my husband, me, and our youngest child are positive. And now we have a support group that meets at our home on Friday nights, which you come so that people can talk to you about some of the things that you shared at the workshop. So for me, that's one of the most exciting things, is to see the things that my colleagues and others at NIH and other universities develop and put into real practice now get translated to people where it makes a difference in real lives because they understand it. They can use it. It's not just in journals. It's not just something we do at major hospitals, but people in the community can go to the clinic and get the prep, or go to the clinic and get the test. And as far as for young virologists, I think that viruses are so fascinating that if you ever study one or even read about one, just follow your heart, follow your instinct. And hopefully the field is now going to continue. Well, we know it's going to continue to be needed over the next million years because of the ability of viruses to evolve. So just do it. It's an amazing, incredible area.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Corbett, do you want to answer one of these questions? One or two? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just stick with the advice piece. For me, I think that the hardest part about science in general, especially if you're Black, is that it's very lonely. And so I think that if science is something that you find yourself taking love to and liking the scientific experience, et cetera, finding ways to have self-care early on in your career and give yourself space from your work is probably the best advice that I think I can give anybody who is starting their trajectory as a virologist or any type of scientist, is to make sure that you have space and rest. Because like we said, I mean, these viruses are mutating and evolving, and the field needs us, and it's going to be a long road even after this pandemic.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say is covered. If you are an aspiring, an aspiring virologist, I would say make sure that you find your community, because it absolutely is lonely and you are forced to persist maybe where we should be supported, as opposed to having to persist through some of the tougher things. If you don't have that community within your school or within your network, I know that most of us are on Twitter and would likely be willing to, in some way, shape, or form, be part of that community, or at least point you in the direction of community that may be closer by. And yes, we need you, and stay, because I would love to see more of us. Like, this has been so fulfilling to just see 3 other Black women virologists, where I didn't even know that any more of us existed a year ago. So like, this is great, and I want to see more of it. And if my goal is to have a virology lab, and I wanted to have a ton of Black women in it and a ton of other, like, I just want a really diverse, like, great, like, I just want it all. I want it to be great. That's what I want. So you have to stay so I can hire you later. So stay.
Sorry, I'm not being hired later. I'm headed to retirement.
Well,
I'm around.
I meant the future virologist, not us, but
that's awesome. Well, I think that wraps things up. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to all the panelists. Like, it was really a joy to hear all of you like speaking. And I think a lot of the audience members have commented in the chat below and said how great this like panel has been for them. Thank you for everyone that decided to attend this panel. We do have plenty of other panels for the rest of the week. Tomorrow, we're going to have 2 panels. One, our Parasitology Day panel, and also our Mycology Day panel is happening. The Mycology one is happening at 6 p.m., I think, and the Parasitology one is happening at 12 p.m., or it might be flipped, but there's a panel at 12 and 6 p.m. for the Parasitology and Mycology Day. So please stay tuned for that and all of the other panels that are happening for the rest of the week. But thank you guys for coming, and, have a good night.
Wait, I have two last things. If you only remember 2 things from this panel: 1, get your flu shot, and 2, they're alive. They're alive.
Viruses are alive. I agree with this.